Okay, sorry about this. I'm having to remember how to use Zoom again. So here's Google Earth, and we're looking at China. Um, so here's Japan over here. Here's the Korean Peninsula, and here's China. Now, what you notice is to the north, which you normally think of as like Manchuria, Siberia. To the west, you've got, sort of Eurasia. To the southwest here, you've got India. To the south, you've got the Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, uh, Myanmar, Cambodia, etc. What's really striking about all this is when you look at this, if we zoom this in just a bit, is if you notice to the north here, the Mongolian region, all deserts and absolutely horrific mountain systems. To the north, again, staggering mountain systems, which I'll show you an image in a sec. To the west, of course, in the southwest, you got the Himalayas, the Gobi and Tian Shan deserts. And then to the southwest, you've got these enormous mountain ranges again, separating it from basically the drainage systems of the Mekong to the south and Southeast Asia. So what you've got is basically almost like a bowl. You've got mountains, desert, mountains, desert, mountains, desert, mountains, mountains. And then to the east, of course, you've got the East China Sea and then the Pacific Ocean. So what you have is on one hand, this enormous fence, if you want to think of it that way. And it's a really unique fence because we normally tend to think of, for example, mountain ranges as being like a single range of mountains. But when you look at this part of the world, because of the tectonic forces in play, so what you end up with is if you look at here, for example, the Tibet region, you basically got 600 miles of mountains. So it's mountain after mountain after mountain. You don't go across a mountain. There's no such thing as a pass that gets you from one side to another, which is true, for example, India and to the west, like Afghanistan. You go over one mountain range, you pass and bang, you're in India. Not China. In China's case, it's totally, totally different. And so on top of that, what you have is the second factor is what we call the loess. The winds that prevail, the jet stream that prevails across this part of the world, moves from the west to the east. And so what it's done over millions of years is just taken up the dust and light soils that would be like the dust that gets in the air that moves across from Europe, Western Asia, Central Asia, and then it hits here, it hits these mountain ranges, and the winds slow down and it drops that dirt. Now, this isn't regular dirt. This is incredibly fine talcum powder type dirt. And that's basically what makes up this whole area here. Now, what this also means is since you've got these enormous mountain ranges here, is the rivers drain to the east. So the vast majority of rivers start in these mountains and they drain to the east southeast. And so you've got these huge river systems that run across China. And one of the side effects of that is the vast majority of China, in the sense of what we think of as sort of typical China, this area here, is actually almost entirely floodplains. So it's basically the rivers come down from up here, the rivers come this way. As they flood, they drop soil off this loess, and that soil fills up and basically takes this over. I'm not sure what it is now because I've put in more dams, but for example, in this area in Jiangsu in the west, what you basically have is every year they add another, I think it's 15 miles of land that gets deposited. And it was much larger before they put in the flood control systems in the 20th century. In fact, one of the classic examples is the Longhe River, the big northern, the Yellow River, sometimes called in English, used to run from here. Basically comes down here and ran here. And it used to go this way. And it filled in all this area here is about, maybe what, 3 to 5 meters high. It's all just flat land because it was all, you can see it's absolutely flat. That's all floodplains from the rivers. So the river went that day, and then all of a sudden, I can't remember, about 900 years ago, there was a major flood, and the river changed course and suddenly swung down here. And now it currently drains out down here. So literally overnight, this whole chunk of China went from having one of the world's largest rivers right in front of their doorstep to suddenly having no water at all. This area here, which really didn't have a lot of water, all of a sudden, wham, it's got one of the world's largest rivers right there. And the reason it could do that is because this area was entirely flat. It literally could be just a short 5-mile wall in the wrong place all of a sudden Boang, the whole, one of the world's largest rivers, changes its course. So the river systems in China are enormously important, and this is one of the concepts that sort of wraps the Chinese logic. The Chinese logic is anything outside of China is trouble. There's never anything good that comes in outside of China, except maybe horses. So traditionally, the Chinese logic, the world outside of China was a world of turmoil, a world of scary stuff, and really wasn't particularly useful. The world of China was the world of the rivers. So basically, this section here. And that was the safe world. You obviously had problems with floods and all that type of stuff, but that's where enormous numbers of people lived, and that's where when you think of Han or Chinese civilization, it occurs in these flat river basins. And to the north, you've got the Huanghe, or the Yellow River. To the southern part, you've got the Yangtze River, and these two rivers and these subsidiaries basically give water to almost all of China, with the exception of these western regions. And these western regions are seriously dry. If you ever want to see some, go to YouTube and then type in Gansu, for example, or Xinjiang, and just look at travel videos of that region, and it brings in some serious concepts of what the word desert actually means. And then you go into here, and all of a sudden, boom, you're in classic Chinese logic of place. So it's important to remember that the Chinese logic is entirely driven in large part by this. Now, what this meant, among other things, is unlike most other areas of the world, the Chinese really didn't have a lot of experience, I suppose would be the way, of dealing with the outside world. They did, but it was invariably in the form of invasion. And so the Chinese view of the other, in the way the Romans thought of, for example, the word barbarian, which meant not of Rome. The Chinese barbarian or barbarios would be much stronger because the Chinese civilization, the Chinese culture develops within the context of this flat floodplain. And so anything outside of that really doesn't have anything to contribute. That's just going to be people who want to take stuff away from you. So everything that's good is going to be within China. Everything that's other, not necessarily, bad in a real positively negative sense, but just isn't of relevance, is outside of China. And this is why, traditionally, especially when the Europeans came in and started, sort of diss on the Chinese, one of the things you say is, well, Chinese saw themselves as the center of the world. That's not accurate, but on the other hand, conceptually, the Chinese certainly did, and I would argue still do, see themselves as the only hugely relevant part of the planet. Everything outside of here is just the other. And if that sounds really strange, I would argue the Americans are exactly the same way. Canada, Mexico, Bolivia, Italy, Montenegro, they're all just the other. And so in a weird way, the Chinese and the Americans, for very different reasons, have very similar mindsets. They started up with sort of a cultural parochialism, I guess, for lack of a better term. And in both cases, it's largely geographically driven. It's driven by place. It's just that they're very different geographies that drive that. Here's an image, whatever place, headed towards Xi'an. So we're crossing northern China. And the key thing about this image is when you look at here, if you just notice, you've just got mountains after mountains after mountains, but it doesn't really see, and I couldn't take a good picture out of the window. It was basically for another 100 miles to the north, it just repeats this. It's almost 300 or 400 miles of nothing but mountains. So if you visualize yourself on foot or on horseback, or hell, even in a Jeep or something like that, okay, fine, you can get to here, but then where do you go? You got this mountain, then you got that mountain, you got that mountain. Staggering, persistent range of boundaries. It's just like having 100 fences, one after the other. And this is what keeps China separate from the rest of the world in three sides. Now, within that, here's the inside. And I apologize for the fact that it's a blurry image, but it's an airplane. This is the Lus River Plateau. This is the Wei River. We're landing in the city of Xi'an in central West China. And this is all that Lus soil. So if you notice, the other place was nothing but mountains. If you notice here, it's nothing but flat. And if you notice the river, there's no river banks per se. I mean, they're there sort of, But this whole thing is nothing but cut by this river. Everything here you can obviously see was the river, and when it flooded, it went a different direction. It just recently went this way. It just recently cut across there. So these rivers do whatever they want to do, and they go wherever they want to go because they've made the landscape. They made this world. This world is entirely driven. In fact, you can say the Wei River here is how yellow it is. That's that loose soil. That's the dirt. It's not quite as bad as the Long Ho, which is what it runs into. But if you actually go to the Long Ho River and you pick up a bottle of water or a glass of water and you let it settle, almost a third or a half of the bottle will be dirt. And that's this soil. And what that's doing is that's going down to the ocean, spilling out of the ocean, and making China ever larger. So China is always growing. But there's these two Chinas. There's the mental China of the mountains, and there's the other mental China of the flats of the safe but dangerous. I mean, these rivers give you water, they give you irrigation. You can see this whole area is planted. But on the other hand, when the rivers rise in the winter, you know, all bets are off. You just might find yourself floating suddenly. Well, this isn't something recent. I mean, it's been going on for millions of years. And so the entire period of the development of Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, etc., is occurring in a very different category in China. And unlike the rest of the world, the landscape was radically different than what we're used to. So what you get is Chinese prehistory, Chinese archaeology comes from a radically different perspective than the Western view. And that's in part, we don't get into it in this class, but I've got some of the other classes. You have to remember that the Western perspective is very much a Euro-American perspective. It's dominated by Judeo-Christian logic. It's very much couched in the concepts of colonialism. So it's very much sort of like the world starts with the classic example of the Middle East, the quote cradle of civilization. Chinese and in fact Southeast Asians would argue that's a really naive and very narrow point of view. The evidence we have is that you have a lot of advanced technology starts first in East Asia, a lot of it in China, some of it in Thailand, at an earlier dates than you have in the quote, cradle of civilization. Frequently, even if you go to modern, articles or even presentations on YouTube that talk about, Rome and places like that being the world's largest cities, they're not even close. At the time of the imperial Rome, Han China had probably 12 cities that were the size or larger than Rome, and the capital, which was Chang'an, Rome would be a couple of suburbs. So this whole idea of a sort of replacing a Western perspective with a more global perspective is that you have to understand that the prehistory of places like China, again, when you think about it, it's a perfect location. You've got mountains for that, those types of ecosystems. You've got your floodplains for those type of ecosystems. And so not surprisingly, what you find is it's an area where when human development starts up, a lot of things tend to occur pretty quickly. Because once you're within China, getting around is pretty easy. It's not like, for example, being in Italy and having to cross the Alps to get to Germany or something like that. So in that context, prehistory in China is a very different phenomena. The Lantian men or some of the earlier Homo erectus, they have the early states outside of Africa and West Asia and China. And they're probably more striking because the materials they're found in are not as suitable to preservation. You have to remember that when you're looking at early, hominids in the world, one of the reasons you find the earliest dates in Africa, West Asia, is ironically simply because the environment over the millions of years has made that better for preservation. So it's not actually that they were necessarily, in fact, likely weren't the first places people showed up, but it's the only ones where the evidence still survives for us to look at today. In China, there's a number of really early sites, largely cave sites, but they're not in places that are as prone to preservation, which gives you some idea of what probably would have been there that's since disappeared that we can't find anymore. In that context, the past landscapes you find in this part of the world tend to be wooded, open grasslands, very suitable for hunting, gathering, and and very much optimal, what we call optimal biomes. And so when the human species, when the Homo sapiens starts up, this is one of the first areas that you find clustering in the sense of people from moving, from individual, I should say, small family groups, starting to cluster into larger populations and ever expanding populations really, really early on. And unlike West Asia, where it tends to be in the few locations that have good environmental conditions, there's a lot more good environmental conditions, especially in West Central China. So you probably had a lot more of this clustering taking place. So not surprisingly, what then happens is the development of more complex societies tends to occur really, really early in China. And it tends to occur in multiple locations, most of which are entirely not known outside of what I might call Chinese or East Asian prehistory, which is a sad state of affairs, but it is sort of is what it is. So, don't worry about these. But if you're interested in this, the Neolithic is the first really striking period that we see in China. And these have, among others, in northwestern China, the Yangshao, to southeast of them, the Longshan. These are large population bases, villages of, 2 to 5,000 people, I guess small towns actually. Complex pottery, complex social systems. They do appear, and this appears to be very typical of much of the world, but especially in East Asia right down till today, is that everything seems to be clustered and focused around the concept of the extended family. Now, this is something we'll get into later, but this is the concept of the clan. This is a group of people that see themselves as related not only in the existing living population, but also in the past. In other words, they share a common heritage, a common history, and a common ancestor. And as far as we can tell, throughout most of Chinese history, and certainly in the Neolithic period, is that these villages would oftentimes be of maybe 2 or 3 of these large extended family or clans. And throughout Chinese history, what you frequently find is these clans go after each other. People being people, it's like my clan's got to be better than your clan. So it's like football or soccer or whatever it is called. And so there's a lot of, on one hand, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of large populations, there's a lot of villages. But the interesting thing, that doesn't mean that they're interacting a lot in the sense that they're sharing and being buddies, having popcorn and watching a movie together or something like that. Just the opposite. In fact, in many cases, it appears. And so what you get is this interesting situation that you've got large populations, but they aren't large unified populations. In many cases, they probably shared common language. They certainly share common pottery, common technology, common symbolism, but I wouldn't want to assume that they shared anything more than that. Now, what happens is this persists until about 7,000, 8,000 years ago. And at that point, what happens is, who knows? I mean, you have to go back in a time machine, but something happens and larger groups start to get organized. The first of these larger political entities, which we would now call sort of a state system, is the Xia. Now, Xia is an interesting concept because it gives an idea of how archaeology and history sort of could be biased. Western archaeologists, historians looking at Chinese history from the outside, argued till maybe 30 years ago that Xia was basically a fictional thing. It was like a fiction in the imagination, and the first real, in quotes, Chinese dynasty was the Shang, which you actually had, documentary evidence, you had physical evidence, etc. Chinese archaeologists have always argued that Xia was real. And the last 30 years, we've now got 3 large Xia towns/cities. There's actually a lot of documentation that's shown up that was done in the Shang period about the Xia, their predecessors. And so what you get is the start of state systems in China. And so it's sequential. The Xia are in a place, something happens, they get largely overthrown or the system collapses and the Shang replaces them. The Shang gets replaced by the Zhou. The Zhou is an interesting system because they actually intentionally replace the Shang or in competition with them. And so what happens is you start to get these state systems. And by this, I'm talking about things that are the size of what even today would be European countries. In terms of populations, probably we're at a minimum hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people total. So, in many cases, even these early states were the size of maybe the Roman Republic, certainly if not the Roman Empire. So they're very, very large. They're Most of this is happening in the north, again, around the Yellow River, the Huanghe. Um, and it involves still the clan systems. So even in these kingdoms, and there's certainly that, what you find is one clan is the kingly clan, and then everyone else is subordinate. The other clans are subordinate to them. And in fact, a lot of the history of this period is various clans then, whacking the guy in charge and putting a new clan in power. And I should point out, this is, we see this in Chinese history, the Tang Dynasty, perfect case in point, as we'll see. So what you find is basically the social system or the political system might have remained sort of intact, but the players at the top of the food chain change. What you also find is a real striking contrast to the European system. In the European system, going way back to the Egyptian period and such, what you find is when bronze and copper technology show up, is that they very quickly get converted to military purposes. In the Chinese system, in the Shang period, what you find is most of the bronze technology gets involved for ritual objects. These are ritual objects, so the living make things out of bronze to public relations or PR their dead relatives, i.e. their ancestors, which is never a huge part of the European system. Even in the Greek period, yeah, you might have had Greek bronze statues to gods. But for one thing, they were gods. They weren't clan ancestors. But the other thing that the Greeks are doing is they're making armor and weapons with it. In the Chinese system, what you find is very, very little military technology is very advanced. What you find is, on the other hand, incredibly complex technology, far in advance of what you find in Europe for maybe almost 500 years down the road, is used for ritual purposes. So it's a totally different mindset in terms of what you do with technology. Do you use technology to deal with the living, like competition, or do you use technology to deal with if you want to think of it as the dead, i.e. the ancestors? And so that's a constant that remains throughout much of Chinese history. In fact, I would argue till maybe the 19th century, Chinese tended to think of technology as something that was used to manipulate ancestors and maybe the world around them, but they really weren't that into, in most cases in Chinese history, into technology for the purposes of militarism. In contrast to the Europeans, who you could argue right from the get-go, one of the main reasons you develop new technology is to kill people. So it's not a better system. It's just a different logic, a different emphasis, a different selection of resources. It's a slightly later period, but this gives you an idea against flying into Xi'an, which was Chang'an. This was the capital for, I think, 10 different dynasties. So these are later. These are largely Tang Dynasty tombs. But it gives you something. Let's just flying over one section of town. Here's a little neighborhood. But if you notice this large pyramid, there's of these large imperial earthen pyramids. I think there's 80. I can never remember. Of the smaller ones, this would have been the consorts and the other members of the court who were tied to this emperor. And there again, what tons more of these. Most of them have been leveled. But you just see these. And again, you have to remember, look at the size of this thing. This is basically the equivalent of a block in modern Honolulu, and certainly a couple of 100 feet high. So, the idea that you spend that time and effort, and that's just one guy. When the emperor that replaces him, maybe 10, 20 years old later, you build the same thing. And you do this for hundreds of years. Sometimes the tombs were built in the ground. Other dynasties that were like the Tang, they were built above the ground. But the idea is that you had to honor these folks because when they're dead, they become ancestors. And so you spend enormous amounts of time and effort to make sure that the living are PRing the dead so that the dead will support the living. And part of the logic is in Chinese logic is that the dead are involved and interfere, if you would, in the affairs of the living. So if you don't PR this guy, if you don't build that tomb, if you don't do something for him, he will, I suppose for lack of a better term, come back and haunt you and make your life miserable. And since he's the emperor, he's not going to make someone's life miserable. He's going to make everyone's life miserable. This is probably the most famous or notorious example. This is the guys we work with. This is the first emperor's tomb, or more accurately, Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb. And this is just one part This is one section. There's 7 other sections like this. Estimated total, we're still not sure because it covers basically all of what would be modern Honolulu is part of this imperial tomb. There's 7 large galleries, if you want to call them that. These were actually originally warehouses, so they had roofs on them, all made of wood and stuff. But they're roughly 25 to 35,000 figures. Now, it's important to remember these things are actually more than life size. They're about 6.5 feet tall, a little over 2 meters tall. And they were all armed. They all had weapons. They all had, the horses had chariots, the horses had saddles. This was basically a reconstruction, if you would, of the imperial guard of the emperor of China, and the whole attitude. And there are also another 9 or 10 wings to this that were all the other, folks, the servants, the bureaucrats, even wrestlers, jugglers, trick animals, parrots, you name it. Basically, it was like someone had rather than taking an image or taking pictures or, done a video of a place, what they did is actually physically copied the place. And the surrealistic aspect, if you actually get closer to these guys, is you find out that they've actually got separate features. So they actually went to some trouble. And they, as far as we can tell, they actually probably just lined up members of the Imperial Guard. And they basically had sculptors come in. The bodies were all sort of mass produced, but the faces were actually, then they would probably have these guys pose and they would make the face. And the attitude was, in their view, is that if this guy has a particular person's face, even though this one's made out of clay and he's then painted and he's armed, when the emperor dies, this thing will come to life and wherever the emperor is and provide his bodyguard. So it says something about the way the Chinese, and this isn't just the first emperor, this is the way the Chinese thought, and they still do think about all this, is that the dead don't go someplace totally different. The dead stay involved in the world of the living. And in its own way, the world of the dead, if you want to think of it that way, has a lot of the same dynamics as the living. So in the case of the first emperor, since he massacred, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, conquered, I think, 8 other major kingdoms, etc., he was really paranoid that when he died, if he didn't take a group of guys like this around his bodyguards, he was going to get his butt kicked for the next, 50 million years or something like that. So these guys were basically the world's largest bodyguard contingent to protect a dead emperor. Now, if the living hadn't done this, the dead emperor would make his first agenda, once he'd figured out where he was, to go and harass the living, to punish them for not having provided him with this, bodyguard. So the living didn't separate themselves, and in China, the living still don't separate themselves from the dead. It's very, very different than the Judeo-Christian concept of dead get buried. I mean, I'm now living in Nevada, and a huge fascination here is cemeteries. People go to cemeteries, they read the tombstones, and I don't think they don't see any relationship. They think of those people as having lived, but they don't think of the folks in the cemetery, I don't think, as actually living. The Chinese see this as very much more like transmogrification, or if you would, a metamorphosis. When you die, you metamorphose into another form, but you don't necessarily go to a really different place. You don't go to a heaven or a hell. The Chinese have the concept of hells. They don't really have a good one of heaven. But that's sort of a ritual place. And again, even there, people can still manifest and deal with living. So there's no separation between heaven, hell, and I don't know what earth. I don't know what you call it. Whatever you want to think about that is. One of the complex side effects of this logic of death and the living is that what very quickly shows up, and we know this is certainly true in the Shang Dynasty, and I'm almost can guarantee it was true in the Xia too. I have no idea why it starts. It probably starts at the village level with maybe the senior members of the clan, or something like that. But very early on, what happens is what eventually gets called the mandate of heaven. And if you want to actually translate more accurately, it'd be the mandate of the heavenly ancestors. And so what happens is in the Chinese system, the folks that PR the ancestors the best score the most points. If you score the most points, you end up in charge. Now, what that also means is if you're in charge and you do a sloppy job of it and you don't PR the ancestors, then they'll pull the support. It's the same way a modern political party. You might be the president of the United States, also the political party decides they don't like you anymore. They pull their support and bang, you're out of power. Someone new is going to get the job. So unlike the European concept of kingship, which is based on genealogy, right now, King Charles of England is ill, so it's very likely that Prince William will become the next King of England in the same way that Charles replaced Queen Elizabeth. That's genealogical. You're next in China in terms of family tree, so you get the job next. In the Chinese system, you might get the job next because you're next in line. But if you do a crappy job or someone doesn't look like can do a better job, the ancestors will step in, pull your legitimacy, and give it to another player. So there's never any sense of, well, I have this job because I was born into it and therefore it's mine. So the European concept of genealogical kinship, of ancestry determines who you are, doesn't go near as far in China. And so what happens is the Chinese go through these cycles. You end up with a group that comes to power. They end up with the mandate of heaven. So a family like in the Tang Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty actually starts. It's a noble family, but they're actually one of many noble families under the dynasty before them called the Sui. They don't like the way the Sui are doing things, so they start a revolt, whack the Sui, and then the Tang become the new players. And the reason everyone accept them is because everyone was sort of unhappy with the way the Sui are doing things. And so when the Tang show up and say, hey, we've got a better way of doing it, they start winning battles. Everyone goes and says, oh, well, the ancestors must be backing you guys because look, you're winning. So in China, what you do is you back a winner. And so what happens is that the Tang Dynasty then comes to power for a couple of 100 years. Now, what happens eventually is genealogically, the guys that become emperors start to become just party boys. They're not doing their job anymore. And so what happens is some of these other families then step in and say, hey, dude, you're not doing your job anymore. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. We can do a better job. And boom, what happens? The system collapses. And with these massive civil wars, in some cases last a couple of 100 years, until eventually the dust settles and a new mandate of heaven comes in, end up with a new central authority. So what happens is these cycles, and they're persistent in Chinese history. In the 20th century, we've seen it. I'm a good bet we're going to see it in the 21st century, the next 10 or 20 years, is that you end up with a central authority. They come to power on the mandate of the population. Or it's again, it's just political. It's the people back you. It's not because my dad was. Everyone thinks, yeah, you're doing a better job, or you can do a better job. You come to authority. You do a better job. Maybe a couple of generations down the road, you continue to do a better job. And then what happens eventually is your family gets sloppy. They get used to being in charge. They don't do a good job anymore. And what happens is other folks think, shit, I can do better than that. And boom, and the system and then fragments. The central authority disappears into warlords or kingdoms, breaks up into parts. That breaks down into large, civil wars, I guess, for lack of a better term. And the end of when the dust settles, boom, you've got a new central authority. This is Chinese history. The only thing that changes is the names of the families involved. But the cycle is the same. And Chinese have always done it this way. This makes it very different than the European systems where you've got, on one hand, you might have hereditary kingships, but you've also got, people conquering their neighbors and all sorts of other stuff going on. That doesn't really happen. The Chinese system is actually pretty straightforward. Central authority, screw up, collapse of political and social support, anarchy, for lack of a better term, and then eventually consolidation. You're back where you're starting in. And that's the Chinese way of doing things, and that's Chinese history. We'll stop with that one for this presentation.